I would be grateful to be able to thank you for your intriguing submission to our open call for papers, which I have to say not many people made it through the process this time, because we were so concerned to make sure we had a coherent agenda. And when Thomas and Rachel wrote their very thoughtful paper for us in the submission phase, I was really excited to meet you both. So I wanted to introduce Thomas Lee, who is a design academic with a background in communications, literary and cultural studies. His research involves understanding people through technology and technology through people. Recently, this has involved the cultural dimension of industries that involve living organisms and technology, such as livestock farming, synthetic biology, and biodiversity conservation. He uses a range of qualitative research approaches to understand what emerging technological changes mean and what benefits and barriers they might offer to relevant stakeholders and communities. And he's here at UTS with Rachel Wakefield-Ram, co-presenter, who's a social scientist with an interdisciplinary background in sustainability science, geography, and political science. Her research focuses across academia, government, and industry, and is focused on systemic approaches to creating more sustainable resource futures that support human health as part of broader ecological health. In particular, she specialises in whole-of-system approaches to the circular economy, including the redesign of product service systems to improve product stewardship, reuse and repair, and ways of addressing toxicants and pollutants in circular supply chains. So we're really blessed that UTS has such firepower in this area on circular design and product stewardship. And so please come up and join us at the stage here and share what you have to tell us about inventories.
That was a good confidence boost. The intros, especially to know that we made it through I'm going to think, a massive amount of potential papers. So that was really nice. And also glad to have both Cameron and Gay on before us, because I think we're a little bit concerned that after the industry focus at the beginning that we might have been a little bit too conceptual and general in our approach, but I think Cameron thoroughly immunised everyone in that space and carried on in the next presentation. So thanks for that as well. Yeah, so to begin with, this is just an intro sort of positioning statement for the presentation. It's more of a contextual framing, and it's not reporting back on particular bits of research that we've gone and done. It's a novel proposition that nonetheless connects with a very significant body of existing academic literature and also new enterprises as well. So interested in inventorying as a particular technological modality that has significant bearing on how the temporalities of use and disuse are conceived and represented in a digitally transformed world, and the world that has been transformed by the digital. And that last little bit's a bit of a nod to anthropologists like Danny Miller's work, who talks about how the world has changed social media as much as social media changing the world. Yeah, a bit of etymology at the beginning. Inventory has an instructive etymology when you're comparing it to things like innovation, which is part of where our conceptual framing is kind of pushed away from. And it comes from basically mean to come up with a list of what is found or just to come upon something. So rather than making new, an inventory is a tallying up or making explicit of what is. But despite these hints of just making do or subsistence, it's nonetheless a kind of an additive action. Counting up things also creates something new as well. It's a form of explication, and this is a concept that the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk uses as his kind of meta concept of modernity, and basically means to kind of unfold latency. Background becomes foreground, and the quote there is, it helps determining the when, where, and how of things become part when, where, and how things become part of knowledge, and in what symbolic forms and logical neighbourhoods they circulate in a society of acknowledges. So all in line with the stuff that's been talked about already today, very much so. And this is just a couple of images from a different paper, Bruno Latour's paper, Circulating Reference, but essentially what his anthropological approach, and maybe to some extent actor network theory generally, is an attendance to these processes of more mundane forms of explication, or what he would call articulation, as part of the generation of new knowledge, rather than just selective novelty. So yeah, just to position this concept of inventorying in relation to a range of existing research, it shares something in common with different fields that have argued for a greater focus on an important but unsung stories about technology recently, stories that focus on what Andrew Russell and Lee Vinsel, in their well-heard call to turn to maintenance as an important process associated with technology, described as the commonplace, also continuity and the mundane, rather than singular events, revolutionary behaviours and spectacular things, as is common in the popular press and perhaps to some extent, as we've heard, in research funding focuses as well. I don't know if you wanted to jump in there at all, Rach. Okay. Yeah, so really interesting work as well that Andrew Russell and Lee Vinsel mention in their call to maintenance is a book by David Edgerton, historian of technology, called The Shock of the Old. And one of the key the key interpretive framing in that book is that histories of technology, and perhaps the way technology is popularly conceived, is on innovation as kind of selective novelty rather than technology in use. And this is kind of evidenced in the way that histories of technology are kind of displayed culturally in museums. Here you can see in the Samsung, it's a right to left timeline. In that instance, I think it's in a museum in Korea. But how technology is thought about is when it comes into being as newness, not how it persists or changes over time. The particular exhibition that Edgerton references in his book is probably even more ambitious in terms of the title. It's The Making of the Modern World, and the way it's organised in terms of its timeline is very much focused on technologies are important when they're birthed into being. So technologies from the 19th century that invented in the 19th century all exist in the same room, 20th century same room, and so on. So they're all clustered at their particular moments of coming into being, which you can kind of see here. And a very different picture and concept of technology comes through when you focus on things like technology in use. And this is the illustration that accompanies, I always get Simon Schaefer and the other fellow who he writes with mixed up, his review of Edgerton's book. And you can see here that this is a very different view of technological being to the images from the museum previously, where there's a focus on things like repair, technology and use, and also a mixing of old and new technologies together. Another really interesting example that Edgerton talks about is the as a kind of counterexample to innovation-centric histories of technology is the timeline of the condom. So invented in the 1930s, and then gradually by dipping glass into latex molds, and increases in use, and then spiked after the Second World War, and then started to rapidly decline after the 1960s and 70s, and then massively spiked again with the AIDS pandemic. So it doesn't neatly plot on to a straightforward linear curve of technologies being introduced, growing, maturing, and declining, like a lot of these schematics pretend. And these are a dime a dozen on the internet when you look up product lifecycle graphics, and there's a pretense to being kind of to some degree communicating something about time as data, but it's broken up in very kind of arbitrary chunks, which don't tell the complexity of a story about a technology, either a particular technology or a category of product. When you start to consider the use phase in particular, just did a bit of hunting around, and I suppose this one's marginally better, where you can see a bit of variation both in the line and in the amount of time allocated to each stage in the product's life cycle. So if you were to plot the condom along that line, as you can see, there's sort of like a growth and then a decline and then a growth again, and then who knows where to from here. So telling a much more interesting story if we don't just think about the moment a new technology comes into being. So this is my final takeaway for that conceptual introduction. Conceptual interpretations and visualizations influence the way technologies are used and become meaningful in our lives, and temporalities of use are often not adequately described or represented. This has consequences for how the environmental impact of products are understood. Over to you, Rach.
Thank you. So, I mean, I guess Tom's been kind of like looking back at how the story of innovation has been told. But I think also if we look forward at the types of models and diagrams that we use to think about things like moving to a circular economy or even sustainable product cycles, we see that the temporality of use, disuse and decline as an important variable influencing the product's potential impacts is also really disregarded. And that was kind of perfectly illustrated this morning with the hibernation of different items in our homes. And that is just such a tiny aspect of that problem. So also information infrastructure and inventory practices determine what is counted and made visible, and therefore what informs what is made, used, traced, and also discarded. So by kind of excluding the temporality of use and also what we're kind of counting and looking at in those phases, we lose a lot of really, really important variables. So the requirements of information management and inventories have become a lot greater as kind of the proliferation of things and information has become more complex, and perhaps as Cameron has suggested, they've also shifted ontologically. So we're counting different types of things now. So another quote here from Russell and Vinsel: as individuals and groups constructed businesses, government agencies, and large-scale technical systems, they multiplied the number of things that needed to be constantly maintained for society to function. Addressing maintenance issues was a crucial part of developing the organizational routines that every company, government agency, or other institution needed to survive. So I thought I'd go through just a couple of examples to make this a little bit more tangible of how information infrastructure and inventory can shape innovation and waste practices, or are currently. So I thought I'd start with a kind of a positive one and then move to a slightly more cautionary one. So I guess things just in a really general sense, like digital inventory technologies are behind circular strategies like digital passports, which many of you have probably heard of, which are increasingly being used for, I've kind of lumped it crudely as 4 critical purposes. So one is to hold producers accountable for the fate of their products through product stewardship, to enable products to be returned for recycling or refurbishment at end of life, to ensure potentially hazardous materials are not recirculated into new products, and to enable innovative circular business models such as chemical leasing. So this is, I idealize, I'm not suggesting any of this is happening kind of perfectly at this stage. But there is this really interesting example that I thought I'd highlight, which is a platform called My Turn. Has anyone heard of My Turn? No. So it's essentially, it sounds really, really basic. So they were developed initially by, it was a kind of a tech nerd got involved with the community tool library. West Seattle, there we go. And he basically developed this platform that just took account of everything that they had. And he did it in quite a sophisticated way where he said where everything was, what everything was, attached a user manual, attached information about the state of the product and exactly kind of where it was at any time. And so essentially this has been scaled across the kind of community of tool libraries around the world. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and there's a quote, yeah, so it's saying durable and repairable products managed with this platform are typically used 1,000 to 10,000% compared to individual ownership. So they've kind of started to quantify it. But the thing that I found really, really interesting about this was it started to be used by other businesses and governments, even just to figure out what they have. And so in the process of talking to businesses and governments, they would find they were speaking to, I think it was a defense department, and they had artillery and all of this kind of maritime inventory that they had absolutely no idea they even possessed anymore. And so they're uncovering this really, really interesting story of disuse that I think is probably similar to what we were kind of hearing this morning about phones, where companies and governments procure all of these things, then lose it and don't know what to do with it. And then it just sits in this state of disuse for a really long time because they just, for whatever reason, can't let go of those things or have literally lost those things. And so this platform has started to provide a means of tracking and keeping those things, but then also allowing for asset sharing between government agencies and others. So it'd be interesting to see if you could tack on kind of affordances to do with logistics and things like that. It just seems like a really interesting thing to kind of enable those really meaningful kind of interventions we want to start seeing in the circular economy. They're about more effectively sharing resources that we already have at a community level. And there's also, it's built from the ground up in a way because people can contribute what they want. They can create the categories themselves. So I want to then move on to a slightly more cautionary tale. And I guess it gets back to the point of like the way that we design infrastructure makes information infrastructure, makes some things visible while making other things invisible. And then those categories are often naturalized and scaled and used for other purposes. So as many of you in this room, I'm sure, know, plastics and electronics are recycled into many, many products at the moment. So the plastics themselves are turned into things like toys, home appliances, office furniture, play equipment, a whole range of things. And even more so than other plastics, which are chock full of plasticizers, they have additives like phthalates, flame retardants, and heavy metals. And recent analysis in the Netherlands, which has close to the tightest regulations you could have at this point on this stuff, estimated that 22% by mass of flame retardants from the original product end up in recycled plastic products, and toys in particular, unfortunately. And another European study estimated that 1,500 recycled e-waste products found elevated levels of hazardous plasticizers in all samples. And this is a problem that's been allowed because when we're categorizing the attributes of products for recycling, it wasn't considered relevant to categorize toxicants in that list. And so it makes us start having to think about who's creating these lists of attributes, who's getting to contribute, and who's being excluded from that story. And I won't go too far into this, but I think this particular problem goes back to what it's a fantastic history of science scholar called Evan Hepler-Smith, who has a fantastic paper called Molecular Bureaucracy, where he traces back the history of how we've come to know chemicals as what they are, and talks about the process in kind of the mid-20th century where people kind of prior to this, there were all different ways of kind of noting down what chemicals were at any point in time, because chemicals don't actually have a fixed molecular identity naturally. And so they basically came up with this system. You can see them actually doing it there, where you would give each chemical a particular identity. And the purpose of that identity was to help the chemical innovators in the kind of emerging plastics and petrochemicals industry to be able to identify and share information about those toxic chemicals. I guess, but the problem is those lists were then used for other purposes, such as attempts to regulate hazardous chemicals. And they're not fit for purpose to do that, but because the lists had been kind of naturalized and black boxed to a degree, that they were never questioned. So Hepler-Smith says, the way an information resource itemizes the basic units of a scientific domain shapes what can be done with the data it contains. Recognizing this, their creators tended to design them with specific purposes in mind. Reused for other purposes or in other domains, they can carry with them the capacities for which they were originally designed. So we have this huge challenge now where we're trying to design toxic chemicals or regulate for toxic chemicals in products, but the way that they're categorized doesn't and kind of stored in these kind of pre-existing information infrastructures isn't allowing for that. And I think there are, as Gay has mentioned, many, many reasons to move away from the recycling, but this is one of the most problematic. There's just no way of getting toxic chemicals out of most of the products that we're currently recycling. So I guess a couple of quotes to finish on. One of them here is Hepler Smith quoting Boker and Starr, who are kind of these wonderful historians of information systems. And they say ways of dividing up the world are articulated with information technologies and bureaucracies. The entrenchment of categories obscures their contingency. Ontology, whatever else it is usually just forgotten infrastructure. So I guess just, yeah, driving home the point that as we're creating new information systems to manage things like the circulation of products, be it reuse systems or recycling systems, we need to, I guess, question who's going into building those categories, who's being excluded from that process, and whether we're actually creating new black boxes that are then not questioned or attempted to be transferred to other purposes for which they're not fit for purpose. So I think I've actually probably covered most of those points. Yeah, that's it.